The rain came down in sheets that Thursday evening, transforming the quiet suburban streets into rushing rivers. Marcus Thompson gripped his daughter's hand tighter as they hurried along the sidewalk, their thin jackets doing little to protect them from the downpour. 7-year-old Amara stumbled, her worn sneakers squelching in a puddle, and Marcus caught her before she fell. They'd been walking for hours, ever since the shelter turned them away. Full capacity, they said, with apologetic eyes that did nothing to keep them dry. Marcus had been a proud man once. He'd worked as an electrician, provided for his family, owned a small house with a yard where Amara could play. But cancer didn't care about pride. His wife Sarah's illness had drained their savings, maxed out their credit cards, and eventually taken her life. The medical bills that remained were a mountain he couldn't climb. 6 months after Sarah's funeral, the foreclosure notice came. Marcus had tried, God knows he'd tried, taking odd jobs, staying with friends until he'd exhausted every favor, every option. Now, as lightning split the sky, he found himself in a neighborhood he barely recognized. Massive estates lined the streets, each one set back behind iron gates and manicured lawns. These were the kinds of homes he'd only ever entered through service entrances, toolbox in hand, there to fix someone's chandelier or rewire their home theater. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now on the outside looking in, homeless in a neighborhood of excess. "Daddy, I'm cold," Amara whimpered, and the sound broke his heart. Her lips had taken on a bluish tint, and she was shivering violently. Marcus knew they needed shelter soon. The temperature was dropping, and hypothermia was a real danger. He scanned the street desperately, looking for anything. A bus stop with an awning, a church, an unlocked garage. That's when he saw it. The mansion at the end of the cul-de-sac was the largest on the block, a sprawling Mediterranean-style villa with cream-colored walls and a terracotta roof. But what caught Marcus's attention was the gate. It was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the wind. Through the bars, he could see a covered portico, a dry space where they could wait out the storm. He hesitated. Trespassing on a property like this could mean police, jail time, losing Amara to the system. But looking down at his daughter's shaking form, the decision made itself. "Come on, baby," he whispered, pulling her through the gate. They ran up the long driveway, their footsteps silent on the wet pavement. The portico was even better than he'd hoped, deep and dry, with a cushioned bench built into the wall. Marcus pulled off his jacket and wrapped it around Amara, then held her close, sharing what little body heat he had left. She curled into him, still trembling, and he whispered promises he wasn't sure he could keep about everything being okay. As the storm raged on, Marcus closed his eyes and prayed for morning. Eleanor Ashford couldn't sleep. At 63, she'd grown accustomed to insomnia, another companion in the too-quiet mansion that had once housed a family but now held only her and the ghosts of better days. She stood at her bedroom window, watching the storm with a glass of whiskey in her hand, when she noticed movement on her security camera feed displayed on her tablet. 2 figures huddled under her front portico. Her first instinct was to call security. Her estate manager, Richard, had warned her countless times about keeping the gates locked, about the dangers of living alone in such a large property. But something made her pause. Zooming in on the camera, she saw them clearly, a man and a small child, pressed together for warmth. The girl couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, wearing clothes that were soaked through, her small frame shaking. The man held her protectively, his body curved around hers like a shield. Eleanor's mind flashed to another rainy night, 32 years ago, when her own daughter Amanda had been caught in a storm during a school field trip. The bus had broken down, and Amanda had called home, terrified and crying. Eleanor had driven through worse weather than this to get to her, would have moved mountains to bring her baby home safe. But all the money in the world hadn't saved Amanda when cancer came calling 20 years later. Eleanor had spent millions on treatments, flown her to the best specialists in the world, and still watched her daughter fade away. Setting down her glass, Eleanor grabbed a robe and made her way downstairs. The mansion felt cavernous at night, her footsteps echoing on marble floors as she passed through rooms filled with expensive art and furniture that no one ever used. She'd made her fortune in tech, selling her startup for $3.7 billion at the height of the dot-com boom, then investing wisely. But money, she'd learned, was just paper and numbers. It couldn't buy back the people you loved or fill the silence they left behind. She opened the front door slowly, not wanting to startle them. The man's head snapped up immediately, his eyes wide with fear and something else, shame. He stood quickly, positioning himself between Eleanor and the child, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "I'm sorry," he said immediately, his voice rough. "We'll leave right now. We just needed somewhere dry for a few minutes." "The storm, my daughter. Please, we're going." "Wait," Eleanor said, her voice gentler than she'd expected. Up close, she could see them more clearly. The man was probably in his mid-30s, with kind eyes and the weathered look of someone who'd been through hardship. The girl peered out from behind him, her brown eyes enormous in her small face, her natural hair plastered to her head. Both were soaked to the bone, shivering. "You can't go out in this. It's not safe." The man shook his head. "We can't. I shouldn't have. This is trespassing. I'm sorry, ma'am. We'll find somewhere else." But even as he spoke, the little girl swayed on her feet, and he caught her with a father's instinct. Eleanor saw the panic flash across his face, the desperate calculation of a parent with no good options. She'd seen that same look in the mirror during Amanda's final months, the terrifying realization that love alone wasn't enough to protect her child. "Come inside," Eleanor said, making the decision. "Just until the storm passes." Marcus stared at the elegant woman standing in the doorway, convinced he'd misheard. Her silver hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and even in a bathrobe, she radiated the kind of effortless grace that came with generations of wealth. Behind her, through the open door, he could see gleaming marble floors and a chandelier that probably cost more than he'd made in 5 years. She wanted them to come inside. "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but we can't," Marcus started, but Eleanor cut him off with a wave of her hand. She'd already turned and was walking back into the house, leaving the door open behind her. "I'm making coffee," she called over her shoulder. "And I think I have some hot chocolate for the little one. The kitchen's warmer than out there." Marcus looked down at Amara, who had started shivering so hard her teeth were chattering. Her lips were still that frightening shade of blue-purple, and when he pressed his hand to her forehead, her skin felt like ice. The responsible thing, the safe thing, would be to thank the woman politely and leave before this became complicated. But as another roll of thunder shook the sky and Amara whimpered, pressing closer to him, Marcus knew he was out of good choices. "Just for a little while," he whispered to Amara, lifting her into his arms. She was too heavy for him to carry comfortably anymore, growing like a weed despite their circumstances, but right now she felt impossibly fragile. They stepped through the doorway together, and Marcus was immediately struck by the warmth of the house. Central heating, something he'd taken for granted once and now recognized as the luxury it was. The entryway alone was larger than any apartment he'd been able to afford in the past 6 months. A sweeping staircase curved up to the second floor, and artwork that looked like it belonged in a museum lined the walls. Marcus felt acutely aware of the water they were dripping onto the pristine floors, the mud on their shoes, the way they didn't belong in a place like this. He'd grown up working class, his father a janitor and his mother a nursing assistant. They taught him pride in honest work, but they'd also taught him to recognize when you were in someone else's world. "The kitchen's this way." Eleanor's voice came from down a hallway, and Marcus followed it, still carrying Amara. They emerged into a kitchen that looked like something from a cooking show, professional-grade appliances, granite countertops, a breakfast nook with windows that probably had a beautiful view when it wasn't pitch black outside. Eleanor was already pulling out mugs, her movements efficient and practiced. "Sit," she instructed, gesturing to the breakfast table, and Marcus obeyed, setting Amara down in one of the cushioned chairs. The little girl immediately curled into a ball, still shaking. Eleanor appeared with a thick throw blanket, cashmere, Marcus noted automatically, and wrapped it around Amara's shoulders. "We need to get her out of those wet clothes," Eleanor said, looking at Marcus. "They're making her colder. I have some things that might work temporarily." The practicality in her voice made something in Marcus's chest loosen slightly. She wasn't treating them like charity cases or criminals, just people who needed help. "Thank you," he managed, his voice rough with emotion he was trying to suppress. "We won't stay long. Just until the storm." "Until you're both warm and dry," Eleanor corrected, pulling out a tin of hot chocolate. "Everything else can wait." 20 minutes later, Amara was wearing an oversized t-shirt that hung to her knees, a relic from some corporate event Eleanor barely remembered, and thick socks that kept slipping down. Her wet clothes were tumbling in Eleanor's dryer, and color had finally returned to her cheeks. She sat at the kitchen table, both hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate topped with an impressive mountain of whipped cream, her eyes wide as she took in her surroundings. Marcus had refused to change out of his wet clothes at first, insisting they'd be leaving soon, but Eleanor had simply raised an eyebrow and pointed out that he was dripping on her Italian tile. Now he wore a sweatshirt that had belonged to Eleanor's late husband, the Stanford logo faded from years of washing. He nursed a cup of black coffee, his shoulders still tense, ready to bolt at the first sign they'd overstayed their welcome. "What's your name?" Eleanor asked Amara gently, settling into a chair across from them with her own coffee. The girl looked at her father for permission before answering. "Amara," she said softly. "Amara Rose Thompson. I'm 7 3/4." That precision made Eleanor smile. Amanda had been the same way at that age, every fraction of a year important and worth noting. "That's a beautiful name," Eleanor said. "I'm Eleanor. This is my house, though it's really much too big for just me." She saw Marcus shift uncomfortably at that, and continued before he could speak. "I'm glad you found shelter here. That storm came up fast." It was a careful dance, this conversation, acknowledging the reality of their situation without forcing them to explain or justify themselves. Eleanor had learned over decades in business that sometimes what people needed most was dignity, not charity. Amara was warming up now, literally and figuratively. "We were looking for the shelter," she volunteered, "but it was full. Daddy said we'd find another place, but then the rain got really bad." Her voice was matter-of-fact, the words of a child who'd learned to adapt to circumstances beyond her control. "We've been walking a lot lately. Daddy says it's an adventure." Marcus's jaw tightened, and Eleanor saw the shame flash across his face. "Amara," he said quietly, a gentle warning. But Eleanor shook her head. "Adventures can be challenging," she said carefully. "I used to tell my daughter that life was one big adventure, full of unexpected turns." She paused, then asked, "Are you hungry? Both of you?" "I have sandwich fixings, soup, probably some leftover pasta from dinner." "We're fine," Marcus said automatically, but his stomach betrayed him with an audible growl. Amara giggled, then quickly covered her mouth. Eleanor stood up, without asking permission, moving to her enormous refrigerator. "I'll make something light. I can't sleep on an empty stomach." It wasn't a question, and she didn't wait for an answer. As Eleanor pulled out ingredients, Marcus found himself relaxing incrementally. There was something soothing about watching her work, the comfortable domesticity of it. She wasn't performing kindness for an audience or making a show of her generosity. She was just making sandwiches. Good ones, too, with thick sliced turkey, fresh tomatoes, real Swiss cheese. She cut them into quarters and brought them to the table with chips and sliced apples. Amara dug in immediately, and Marcus realized with a pang how hungry his daughter must have been. They'd split a $1 menu burger earlier that day, and before that, he couldn't remember. The days blurred together when you were focused on survival. He ate too, slower, trying to maintain some sense of control even as he accepted this woman's kindness. "Thank you," he said again. And this time Eleanor heard everything in those 2 words: gratitude, desperation, pride struggling against necessity. "You're welcome," Eleanor replied simply, and for the first time in years, her kitchen felt like a home. The storm showed no signs of stopping. If anything, it had intensified, the wind howling around the mansion like something alive. Eleanor glanced at the clock, nearly midnight, and then at Amara, who was fighting to keep her eyes open despite her earlier nap on Marcus's shoulder. The little girl had that exhausted look of a child who'd been running on adrenaline and fear for too long. "There are guest rooms upstairs," Eleanor said, making her voice casual. "Plenty of them. The storm's supposed to last until morning according to the weather report. You're welcome to stay." She saw Marcus about to protest and held up her hand. "I'm not suggesting you live here. I'm suggesting you sleep in a bed tonight because the alternative is dangerous and foolish. You can leave first thing in the morning if you want." Marcus wanted to refuse. God, how he wanted to refuse. Accepting help felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that he'd failed as a father and provider. But Amara was practically falling asleep at the table, and the thought of taking her back out into that storm, of trying to find some doorway or overpass to huddle under, made his chest tight with anxiety. One night, he heard himself say, "And we'll do something to repay you. I'm an electrician. Was an electrician. I can fix things, do repairs, whatever you need." "We'll discuss it in the morning," Eleanor said, which wasn't a yes or a no, and Marcus appreciated her for not making this transactional. She stood and gestured for them to follow. "Come on. I'll show you where you can sleep." They climbed the grand staircase, Amara's hand in Marcus's, their footsteps silent on the plush carpet runner. The second floor was just as impressive as the first, with wide hallways and doors that led to room after room. Eleanor opened one near the staircase. "This was my daughter's room," she said quietly. "I've redecorated since she passed. But it's comfortable." The room was beautiful, a queen bed with a fluffy white comforter, matching nightstands, a bookshelf full of novels, and an ensuite bathroom. It looked like something from a hotel magazine, perfectly appointed and utterly impersonal. Marcus could see the care Eleanor had taken to erase the memories, and it made him sad for her. Amara's eyes went wide. "We get to sleep here?" She looked at the bed like it was made of clouds. Eleanor smiled, and for the first time that evening, it reached her eyes. "You do. There are fresh towels in the bathroom if you want to take a shower, and the water gets nice and hot. Toothbrushes in the cabinet under the sink. I buy them in bulk for guests." Another small mercy, not making them ask for basic necessities. When Eleanor left, closing the door softly behind her, Marcus stood in the center of the room feeling disoriented. The contrast between where they'd been just hours ago, wet, freezing, desperate, and where they were now felt surreal. Amara had already climbed onto the bed and was bouncing slightly, testing it. "Daddy, it's so soft." Her joy was uncomplicated, unburdened by the shame he carried. "How about we get you cleaned up, Peanut?" Marcus suggested, ushering her toward the bathroom. The shower was everything Eleanor promised. Hot water that seemed endless, fluffy towels, even fancy soap that smelled like lavender. He helped Amara wash, combed through her hair with his fingers, and put her back in the oversized t-shirt. She was asleep almost before her head hit the pillow, exhaustion finally claiming her. Marcus took his own shower after, standing under the spray until the bathroom filled with steam. He let himself have this moment, clean, warm, safe, before the guilt crept back in. What kind of father let things get this bad? What kind of man accepted charity from a stranger? But beneath the guilt was something else, gratitude so profound it made his eyes sting. Eleanor's kindness tonight had been more than shelter. It had been a reminder that they were human, worthy of basic dignity and care. That maybe, just maybe, they weren't as alone as he'd feared. Eleanor woke at dawn, habit and insomnia combining to pull her from the few hours of fitful sleep she'd managed. For a moment, she forgot about her guests, going through her usual morning routine, coffee, newspaper, emails. Then she heard it, a child's laughter, bright and musical, coming from somewhere in the house. The sound stopped her in her tracks. It had been so long since she'd heard a child's laughter in these walls. She found them in the breakfast nook, early morning light streaming through the windows. Marcus was already up, dressed in his now dry clothes, and he'd clearly been exploring the kitchen. He had eggs scrambling on the stove, toast in the toaster, and was attempting to make coffee in her complicated espresso machine. Amara sat at the table, coloring on the back of an old envelope with a pen, humming to herself. "I'm sorry, Marcus said immediately when he saw her, looking embarrassed. I should have asked. I just thought, Amara woke up hungry, and I wanted to do something, not just take and take. He gestured at the stove helplessly. I can clean this up. Well, get out of your hair. Eleanor surprised herself by feeling disappointed at the prospect. The house felt less empty with them in it, less like a museum and more like a home. Don't be ridiculous, she said, moving to the espresso machine. That thing is needlessly complicated. Let me. She made them all coffee, regular for Marcus, with extra cream for herself, and surveyed his cooking. You're making breakfast. That's nice. It's been a long time since someone cooked in this kitchen. They ate together as the sun rose fully, painting the kitchen in shades of gold. Eleanor learned more about them in that breakfast than she had the night before. Marcus told her about his wife, Sarah, and how her death had started their downward spiral. About the medical bills and the foreclosure and the desperate, fruitless search for work that paid enough to rent even a studio apartment in an increasingly expensive city. He told her about applying for public housing only to learn the waiting list was 2 years long, about shelters that were full or had age restrictions or weren't safe. I keep thinking I'm one job away from fixing this, Marcus said, staring into his coffee. One good break, one opportunity, and I can get us back on our feet. But it's like the system is designed to keep you down once you fall. No job will hire you without an address. Can't get an address without money. Can't save money without a job. Round and round. There was no self-pity in his voice, just exhausted frustration with an impossible situation. Eleanor listened, really listened, in a way she hadn't listened to anyone in years. She'd been so isolated in her grief, so withdrawn from the world, that she'd forgotten what it meant to engage with other people's struggles. She'd donated to charities, written checks to homeless organizations, convinced herself that was enough. But sitting across from Marcus and Amara, she realized how abstract those donations had been. These weren't statistics or case studies. They were real people, good people, who'd been failed by the safety nets that were supposed to catch them. What kind of electrical work did you do? Eleanor asked, an idea beginning to form. Marcus brightened slightly, the first real animation she'd seen in him. Commercial and residential. I'm licensed, or was it probably lapsed? Wiring, repairs, renovations. I was good at it. Prided myself on quality work, fair prices. Had regular clients before. He trailed off, the unspoken before everything fell apart hanging in the air. Eleanor nodded slowly. Her mind was working through possibilities, logistics, potential complications. She was a problem solver by nature. It's what had made her successful in business. And this, she realized, was a problem she might actually be able to solve. Not fix entirely, not wave a magic wand and erase their struggles, but maybe create an opening, an opportunity for that one good break Marcus needed. I have a proposition, Eleanor said carefully. Hear me out before you decide. Marcus's guard went up immediately. He'd been waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the catch that always came with charity. Nothing in life was free, especially not for people like him. I'm listening, he said cautiously, setting down his coffee cup. Beside him, Amara continued coloring, oblivious to the tension. Eleanor took a breath, organizing her thoughts. This house is enormous. 23 rooms, 8 bathrooms, pool house, guest cottage. It's far too much for one person, but I've kept it because letting it go felt like letting go of memories I'm not ready to release. She gestured around them. But the truth is, the place is falling apart. Not in obvious ways, but in the ways that matter. The electrical system is original from the 1990s and probably a fire hazard. Half the outlets in the East Wing don't work. The pool house needs to be completely rewired before I can legally rent it. I've had contractors come give estimates, and they all say the same thing. It's a major job. She looked directly at Marcus. I need an electrician. Someone who can assess the whole property, prioritize what needs to be done, and do the work properly. It's months of work, maybe longer. In exchange, I'm offering the guest cottage to stay in. It's small but private, 2 bedrooms, full kitchen and bath. Utilities included. And a salary, whatever the going rate is for licensed electricians, plus 20% because you'll be working directly for me and handling project management. Marcus stared at her. You want to hire me? Based on what?
You don't know me.
You don't know if I'm any good at my job. For all you know, I could burn your house down. But even as he spoke, he felt hope rising in his chest, dangerous and desperate. This was it, the break he'd been praying for. You're right, Eleanor agreed. I don't know your work. So here's what I propose. There's a lighting fixture in the library that's been flickering for months.
Fix it today.
If you do good work, we'll draw up a contract and make this official. If not, we part ways and no hard feelings. She pushed back from the table and stood. Let me show you the cottage first. You should see what you'd be agreeing to. They walked through the grounds, Amara skipping ahead, delighted to be outside in the sunshine after last night's storm. The property was stunning. Manicured gardens, mature trees, and at the back, past the pool, a charming cottage that looked like something from a storybook. Eleanor unlocked it and stepped back, letting Marcus explore. The cottage was bigger than he'd expected, a proper house, really, just smaller than the mansion. The living area was cozy with a fireplace, the kitchen updated with modern appliances. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub. It's furnished, Eleanor said, but you could bring in your own things if you have anything in storage. Marcus didn't have anything in storage. They'd sold everything that wasn't essential months ago, but he didn't correct her. Amara had found the smaller bedroom and was spinning in circles, her arms out. Daddy, I could have my own room. And there's a window seat. The pure joy in her voice made Marcus's throat tight. This is too much, Marcus said quietly. Why would you do this? You don't owe us anything. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, looking out the cottage window at the main house. After my daughter died, I threw myself into being busy. Meetings, charity boards, investment portfolios. Anything to avoid sitting still and feeling. But eventually busy wasn't enough, so I isolated. Cut people off, stayed in that big house alone. I told myself I was fine, that I preferred the quiet. She turned to face Marcus, and he saw the loneliness in her eyes, raw and honest. Last night, having you here, hearing Amara laugh, smelling breakfast cooking, feeling like the house was alive again, it reminded me that I'm not fine. That I've been existing, but not living. So maybe I'm being selfish. Maybe I need this as much as you do. Her vulnerability disarmed him completely. This wasn't pity. It was something more complicated and honest mutual need, disguised as opportunity. Marcus looked around the cottage, at Amara peering into closets and testing doorknobs, at the possibility of stability stretching out before them.
Okay, he said.
Let me fix that light fixture. Show me what needs doing. The library was on the first floor of the mansion, a room that managed to be both grand and intimate. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with leather-bound volumes and contemporary bestsellers alike. A rolling ladder gave access to the upper shelves, and the problematic chandelier hung in the center, an ornate fixture with what looked like hundreds of crystals catching and scattering light. Marcus studied it from below, then asked Eleanor for a ladder and basic tools. She directed him to the garage, where he found a workshop that was clearly well-equipped but rarely used. Everything was organized perfectly, tools hanging on pegboards with their outlines traced, but there was dust on most of them. He selected what he needed and returned to the library, feeling a familiar thrill. He'd missed this, the problem-solving, the satisfaction of working with his hands, the pride of doing something well. Amara sat in one of the library's reading chairs, a picture book open in her lap, pretending to read. Eleanor had given her free rein of the children's section, books that had once belonged to Amanda. Marcus glanced at his daughter periodically as he worked, grounding himself in her presence. This job, this opportunity, it wasn't just about him. It was about giving her a childhood, a chance at normalcy. The flickering wasn't the bulbs, as he'd suspected. It was loose wiring in the junction box, combined with an improperly installed dimmer switch. Someone had tried to upgrade the system without understanding the existing infrastructure. Marcus worked carefully, methodically, shutting off power to the room before touching anything. He rewired the connections, replaced the faulty dimmer with a proper one, and checked every connection twice before restoring power. "Try it now," he called down to Eleanor, who'd been working on her laptop in the corner, pretending not to watch him. She flipped the switch, and the chandelier blazed to life, steady and bright, the crystals throwing rainbows across the walls. She tried the dimmer, smooth operation, no flickering. "Well," she said, looking impressed. "That's been driving me crazy for 8 months. 3 different electricians told me the whole fixture needed to be replaced." Marcus climbed down and packed his tools. "The fixture is fine. Beautiful, actually, probably 1920s, original to the house. The problem was someone didn't know what they were doing with the wiring. I can tell you right now, if that's the quality of electrical work throughout this house, you're lucky you haven't had a fire." He wasn't being dramatic. He'd seen several junction boxes that were borderline dangerous. "I'd need to do a full assessment, but I'm guessing your whole system needs updating." Eleanor nodded slowly. "That's what I was afraid of. But now I have someone I trust to do it right." She extended her hand. "Do we have an agreement? I'll have my attorney draw up a proper contract, but can we shake on it now?" Marcus looked at her hand, then at Amara, who was watching with wide, hopeful eyes. This was real. This was happening. He took Eleanor's hand, her grip firm and businesslike, and shook it. "We have an agreement," he said, and felt the weight of 6 months of desperation lift slightly off his shoulders. Not gone. He was realistic enough to know that recovery would take time, that this was a beginning, not a solution. But it was a beginning, and that was more than he'd had yesterday. The first week was an adjustment. Marcus woke up every morning in the cottage, disoriented by the silence and comfort, half expecting to find it had all been a dream. But then he'd hear Amara in her room, singing to herself as she got dressed, and reality would settle around him like a warm blanket. They had a home. Temporary, yes, and dependent on his continued work, but a home nonetheless. Eleanor had been true to her word. The contract her attorney drew up was fair, more than fair. She was paying him market rate for a master electrician plus that 20% premium, and she'd structured it so that a portion went directly into an escrow account he couldn't touch for 6 months. "For savings," she called it. "So that when this job is done, you have options." The gesture had made him emotional in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He started with a comprehensive assessment of the electrical system, mapping out every circuit, testing every outlet, documenting every hazard. The work was exactly as extensive as he'd feared. Decades of improper additions and repairs had created a tangled mess that would take months to properly sort out. But Marcus found himself energized by the challenge. This was meaningful work, work that mattered, and he was good at it. Amara was thriving. Eleanor had broached the subject of school carefully, offering to help with enrollment and supplies. Marcus had been hesitant. Accepting help was still difficult, but Amara's education couldn't wait. The local elementary school was excellent, Eleanor assured him, and within a week, Amara was attending 2nd grade, making friends, bringing home artwork that Eleanor proudly displayed on the mansion's refrigerator as if she were a grandmother. The relationship between Eleanor and Amara developed organically. Marcus would work long days, and when Amara got home from school, she often gravitated toward the main house, where Eleanor would have snacks ready. They'd talk about Amara's day, or Eleanor would help with homework, or they'd simply sit together in the library, reading. Eleanor never tried to replace Sarah, no one could, but she provided something Amara desperately needed: stability, feminine energy, grandmotherly affection. Marcus watched their growing bond with mixed feelings. He was grateful, deeply so, but also aware of how easily this could all disappear. What happened when the electrical work was done? What happened if Eleanor got tired of having them around? He tried to protect himself, maintain emotional distance, but it was hard when Eleanor would leave dinner in the cottage's oven on nights he worked late, or when she'd ask his opinion on business decisions over morning coffee, treating him as an equal rather than an employee. "You're allowed to relax, you know," Eleanor told him one evening. They were on the mansion's back patio, watching Amara practice cartwheels on the lawn. "I can see you waiting for the other shoe to drop. I'm not going to suddenly change my mind about this arrangement." Marcus took a sip of his beer. Eleanor had insisted he help himself to anything in her house, and considered her words. I'm not good at accepting help, he admitted. Especially when I can't repay it. You've given us so much, and I'm afraid. He stopped, not sure how to articulate the fear. That he'd disappoint her. That this was all too good to be true. That he didn't deserve this second chance. Eleanor seemed to understand anyway. You're giving me something too, she said quietly. You're making me remember what it feels like to be needed, to be part of something that has value you can't quantify. As they sat in comfortable silence, watching Amara play, Marcus allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they could build something lasting here. 6 months later, Marcus stood back and surveyed his work. The mansion's electrical system was completely updated, every circuit running clean and safe, every outlet functioning perfectly. The pool house had been fully rewired and was now a beautiful, rentable space. He'd even added outdoor lighting throughout the gardens, transforming the grounds into something magical at night. The work had been exhaustive, challenging, and deeply satisfying. It had also come to an end. The escrow account Eleanor had set up now held enough money for Marcus to put down first and last month's rent on a decent apartment, buy a used car, and have a cushion while he looked for his next job. He'd gotten his electrician's license renewed, and with Eleanor's reference and the documentation of this massive project, he had a portfolio that would open doors. He was employable again, stable again. He'd pulled himself and Amara out of the hole they'd been in. But the thought of leaving made his chest tight with something that felt like grief. Amara had flourished here. Her grades were excellent. She had close friends, and she adored Eleanor. The woman had become a fixture in their lives, someone who attended Amara's school plays and helped with science projects and taught her to play chess. For Amara, this place had stopped being temporary and had become home. For Marcus, it was more complicated. He'd started to feel something for Eleanor that went beyond gratitude or friendship. She was brilliant and kind, sharp-witted and generous, and somewhere along the way, sharing morning coffee and evening conversations had become the best parts of his day. But she was also a billionaire who'd taken them in out of charity, and he was terrified of misreading the situation, of ruining what they had by wanting more. Eleanor had been quieter than usual the past few weeks, and Marcus wondered if she was preparing herself for their departure. The contract was complete after all. He'd fulfilled his end of the bargain, and there was no reason for them to stay. Except that none of them seemed to want to go. It was Amara who forced the conversation, in the way only children can. They were having dinner together at the mansion, something that had become a nightly ritual, when she looked up from her spaghetti and asked, "Are we leaving soon, Daddy?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions. Marcus set down his fork, unsure how to answer. "The electrical work is done, Peanut," he said carefully. "We've been here 6 months, which is longer than we planned. Eleanor's been very generous, but we can't stay forever." Even as he said it, his heart rebelled against the words. Amara's face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. "But I don't want to leave. This is my home. Eleanor is my—" She looked at the older woman desperately. "I don't want to go." Eleanor reached across the table and took Amara's hand, her own eyes suspiciously bright. "I don't want you to go either, sweetheart." She looked at Marcus, and something vulnerable and honest passed between them. "I've been trying to figure out how to ask you to stay without making it awkward or pressuring you. The truth is, I've loved having you here. Both of you. This house feels like a home again, and I've felt like a person again, not just a sad old woman rattling around in too much space." "You're not old," Marcus said automatically, then felt himself flush. Eleanor smiled at him, soft and genuine. "The pool house is finished," she continued. "It's bigger than the cottage, with 3 bedrooms. I'd been planning to rent it out, but I'd rather have you there. Both of you. Not as employees or charity cases, but as family, I suppose. If you want that." Marcus felt his carefully constructed walls crumbling. "Eleanor, I can't just accept," but she cut him off with a look that reminded him she hadn't built a billion-dollar empire by accepting nonsense. "Stop thinking of it as charity. Think of it as investment. You're a talented electrician. Start your own business. Use the pool house as your base. build your client list. You'll pay rent once you're established market rate. In the meantime, you give me someone to talk to over coffee and someone to fix things when they break, and Amara gives me a reason to bake cookies and attend school functions. And I get to stay in my room? Amara asked hopefully, already seeing the bright side. Eleanor laughed, the sound lighter than Marcus had ever heard. You get to stay in your room. We can even paint it that purple color you've been hinting about. Amara squealed and launched herself at Eleanor, hugging her fiercely. Over his daughter's head, Eleanor met Marcus's eyes. What do you say? She asked quietly. Marcus thought about pride, about independence, about all the reasons he should say no. Then he thought about Amara's happiness, about the rightness of sharing morning coffee with Eleanor, about the way this place had become home despite his best efforts to keep his distance. He thought about second chances and the courage it took to accept them. I say yes, he answered, his voice rough with emotion. But I'm paying rent as soon as the business is profitable. And I'm fixing everything in this house that breaks for the rest of my life. Eleanor smiled, that beautiful warm smile that had become precious to him.
Deal.
Though you should know things break around here all the time. I think it's going to be a very long arrangement. 3 months later, Marcus's business, Thompson Electrical Solutions, had its first major commercial contract. 6 months after that, he hired his first employee. A year after moving into the pool house, he was paying Eleanor rent and had money in savings. Amara's room was indeed painted purple, and she'd added glow-in-the-dark stars to the ceiling with Eleanor's enthusiastic help. But more than the financial stability, more than the successful business, was what had grown between the three of them. They were a family, unconventional, forged by circumstance and choice rather than blood, but real nonetheless. Marcus and Eleanor took things slowly, their relationship evolving from friendship to something deeper with the patient inevitability of dawn. The night he finally kissed her, on the patio where they'd spent countless evenings talking, Eleanor whispered, I stopped believing in second chances after Amanda died. Thank you for proving me wrong. On a rainy Thursday evening 2 years after that storm had brought them together, Marcus found himself in the library, installing smart home technology Eleanor had decided she wanted. Amara was doing homework at the table Eleanor had claimed as her own, and Eleanor herself was reading in her favorite chair. The scene was so domestic, so beautifully ordinary, that Marcus had to stop and just look at them, his family. What are you smiling about? Eleanor asked, catching him staring. Marcus climbed down from the ladder and crossed to her, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Just thinking about storms, he said, and shelter, and how sometimes the worst nights of your life lead to the best days. Amara looked up from her homework, rolling her eyes with the exasperated affection of a 10-year-old who's learned her father is hopelessly sentimental. Daddy's being mushy again. Eleanor laughed and pulled Marcus down onto the arm of her chair. Let him be mushy. We almost lost this, you know. If your father had been too proud to accept help, if I'd been too afraid to offer it, if either of us had let fear win, we wouldn't have this. She gestured around them, not at the mansion or the wealth, but at the three of them together, at the life they'd built. I'm glad we were brave, Amara said simply, with the wisdom children sometimes possess. And Marcus, looking at his daughter and the woman he loved in a house that had become home, could only agree. That storm had stripped away everything he'd thought defined him, his pride, his self-sufficiency, his illusion of control. But in losing those things, he'd found something infinitely more valuable, a family built on vulnerability, generosity, and the courage to accept love when it was offered. Eleanor Ashford had opened her door that rainy night to 2 strangers, seeking shelter. What she'd given them was so much more than that. She'd given them hope, dignity, opportunity, and ultimately a home. But what Marcus and Amara had given her in return was equally profound: purpose, joy, family, and a reason to embrace life again rather than simply enduring it. The electrical work was long since finished, but Marcus still found reasons to tinker around the mansion, and Eleanor still found ways to need his expertise. It was their dance, their way of staying connected while respecting each other's independence. And every morning, They still met for coffee in that same breakfast nook where they'd first shared a meal, talking about everything and nothing, grateful for the storm that had brought them together and the choice to shelter each other that had changed all their lives forever. Years later, when people asked how they became a family, the story always started the same way. On the worst night of our lives, a stranger opened her door. But the real story, the true story, was about what happened after. About choosing each other every day, about building something beautiful from circumstances that could have broken them, about love that grew in the spaces where pride and fear used to live. It was a story about shelter, yes, but more importantly, it was a story about home and the courage it takes to claim it.